It's remarkable that your arc immediately puts you in a place where you distrusted medicine. You felt
Yeah.
the collateral effects heavily by what happened to your mom, and life happened to place you, just as passionate as you are, in the hands of a paradigm that happens to be the Achilles heel to centralized science.
Yeah.
And now it also put you in contact with people who can help you really spread the message at lightning fast speeds. I see you on your story all the time, people messaging you, holy moly, this and this and that, this improved, that improved, I feel better than ever. And the ripples that you're putting out into the world obviously are coming back to you, and they're only increasing. And so I just love watching it. I'm a fan for sure. I have my popcorn. I think I just love the arc that your life is taking. It has the way it started to now, and it's epic. I can't wait to see, because you don't even know how it's gonna unfold. So
I don't. I'm telling you, oh, there's a bee. I'm also a passenger here. I'm like, I don't know where this is going, and everything I'm doing feels involuntary, so I'm just letting it flow through me, and we'll see where it goes. But I also, I have hope motivation in human design, and anyway, I just always felt that way. Like, I'm a very optimistic person. I see the best in scenarios and the potential there, and so I'm very, very hopeful for the future. I think it's going to be just legendary. It's going to be incredible. We just have to get through this bit of a rough patch. It's got a little bit of turbulence to get to paradise, but we're on our way.
yeah, we are. That's awesome. You've been through quite a series of events. Like, I've been watching podcasts of yours and stuff, and you grew up and basically rebelling against the centralized medicine dogma paradigm. You come into Princeton, Rabinowitz lab, the only lab that is funded independently from big pharma. You come across Jack from an Instagram DM, and you happen to like watch it. I was like, man, she watched it from an Instagram DM. You know
I
how many
know.
people would like send links and like, oh, this sounds interesting, but there's too many links, signal from
Yeah.
noise. But you happen to watch that one. Okay. Your whole world changes. You interview Jack, and then in your time in academia, you have connections with doctors, PhDs, etc. One of them being Dr. Gabrielle. You go on her podcast. Jack notices and is like, holy shit, this is the chick I need. And so reaches out to you. And then y'all establish this protege mentor relationship. And from that point on, he's kind of like, hey, you have this vision for a light lab. I can help you. And then he links you up with Nicole and Bobby. And your dharma, your mission is there's this clear runway for it to manifest. And I don't know, I'm just like, this is crazy, like the way the gears of your life are turning. So um
Totally.
if you just want to recapitulate and tell us about how all this stuff has unfolded, particularly the Nicole Shanahan part and your light lab finally coming into the horizon.
Yeah. So it's very weird. And I would say actually my entire life, I'd never had a plan for like the future. I really am just somebody who opportunities present themselves and I pick the one that feels like the best, just intuitively, I would say. So even when I went to Princeton, I've said on other podcasts that like,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't choose Princeton because it's Princeton. I chose it because it was nearby. I could commute
Uh-huh.
there.
That's
Like
crazy.
literally, that was the logic behind it. I was like,
Only
I'm
reason.
sure I'll find something good there. Like I'll just go. And then I got accepted. So I was like, okay, we're just gonna do this. And I mean, I also struggle a lot because I did not want to work with animals because I'm a huge animal lover. And so that was something that I was very hesitant to do. And that's also why Josh, like the Rabinowitz lab, was my third rotation. I kind of put it off, even though I knew it would subject wise probably be a really good fit as a metabolism research lab, and I had this whole weight loss journey and was interested in chemistry in particular and how metabolism is kind of the chemistry of biology. So I was innately interested in that in some level, but I was avoiding it because I didn't want to work with mice. And my first two rotations absolutely sucked. I hated them, and I was going into the third rotation really stressed. And actually, this is an important tale about the how critical having a good mentor is essentially, because when I went in for my third rotation in Josh's lab the first day, I was paired with a postdoc named Chol-Soon Young, he has his own lab at UC Irvine, and he's just like one of the best humans I know. and just curated a really incredible experience for me from day one. He's just very enthusiastic, super curious, super encouraging, just like the best. And so I ended up joining, and that was largely because of his attitude and approach, to be honest, because I mean, Josh is it's a big lab. He's a very hands-off mentor. So having direct mentorship is really important if you are trying to, learn and grow, etc. So I ended up joining the lab. I did a lot of work with animals, hated every second of it, but also was very, I guess, glad that I could do it the right way, because I know a lot of other people who just don't even care about the animals and just like if they're causing them pain or whatever. So like that wasn't the way I was gonna conduct things. And like I would even literally say a prayer before I killed any mouse. And to boot, my boss literally by the end of my time, my 5.5 years at Princeton, my boss would literally defer to me because I had the most consistent, most high quality data in the mice. Like if anybody had weird results, it's like, what did Alexis get? Because hers were very consistent. And so I think it really honestly pays off to be compassionate and empathetic when you're working with animals and just in life in general. And so after Princeton, I knew that I really didn't want to work for anybody, and I didn't plan to do a postdoc. I wasn't really interested in going the traditional route, which would be like PhD, postdoc, then start your own lab the canonical way, or go to pharma or biotech or whatever. So I ended up starting my business right after graduating, just basically kind of hitting the ground running. I didn't really know exactly how it would unfold, but I had connected with Gabrielle a few months prior, and I went on her podcast. And so that got me a little bit of a following and people interested in my work. And I was very focused on the microbiome at the time. And so I just, at a pretty low rate, I was just trying to get volume and get experience in. I was, working with clients one-on-one, primarily on like microbiome optimization protocols for different health and performance outcomes. And that's kind of how I cut my teeth and like, getting to know people. In the first year, I probably worked with at least like 150 people, I would say. And then during that year, I realized, wow, working with people one-on-one is extremely draining. Like I can't do this forever, because just holding space for people in that way is just a lot of energy required. And at the same time, I knew that in order to work successfully with people, I needed to have the energy and the desire to hold that space for them. Otherwise, it's not really fair for them either. And so that kind of culminated in me understanding like I need to diversify my income, basically, because if I'm relying on clients to pay the bills, it actually changes the energetic between us. I can't need their money in order to work with them in the best way possible. It has to be just like extra. Basically, they're paying me as a way to give them buy-in to do the work, not like I need the money, because then I'm going to subconsciously or consciously act differently or conduct myself in a different manner that I personally think is suboptimal in like a therapeutic type relationship. So I had some like side gigs that I was using to supplement my income, and I decided to go back for a postdoc at UPenn to kind of get that stable paycheck. And I had connected with a PI at Penn called Christoph Theis, who's like a microbiome researcher, but in general, he's interested in how environmental inputs shape health and disease. So it's pretty broad. And so I started that postdoc in 2023 and was there for that entire year, working on a tech development project. We were essentially looking at imaging tissue slices and being able to detect at this like a spatial resolution the mRNAs and metabolites on a given tissue, and then ultimately the goal of that being to be able to profile tumors or patient tissues, and then be able to understand at a more intricate level what's actually going on in their tumor or whatever tissue we're looking at, to be able to like do a more targeted approach, let's say in like a treatment program or a treatment protocol. So I was working on that. That was helpful because in that background of having a stable source of income again, I could also be more creative. I wasn't in the scarcity mindset as much, where it's like the amount of work that I do is directly proportional to my income. That was a huge problem that I also realized that I needed to solve through some evergreen products, essentially, like things that I can just sell as passive income. And I think as an entrepreneur, that's been like the most important thing, is to be able to have offerings for people at all price points, but then also that people can just purchase and then they can go off with it. It doesn't require anything from me actively. So that was like a huge realization that I had during this period of time, as well as I'm like growing my business and understanding how I want to influence people. And then of course the infamous DM that I received with the podcast of Rick Rubin and Huberman and Jack Cruz on tetragrammaton was sent to me by somebody that I literally can't remember who it was, and I've tried to find them, but I can't find them. And like we talked about in the little prequel to this episode, it kind of changed my life immediately overnight. Not kind of, it did. I was just flabbergasted that I hadn't heard this information before. And when I looked into the research he was talking about, it was literally all there in the centralized research, like the literature. And I was just, in shock that this never came across my path before. And that like circadian biology had been on my radar through Sachin Panda's work, but I just didn't, it wasn't presented in a way that made me feel like it was that important for whatever reason. And the way that Jack delivered it and just everything about him, I just immediately like quantum entangled with his work and with him as a person, and just like went down the rabbit hole and never came back. And literally since then, it's been over a year and a half at this point. I probably studied something like 6 to 8 hours a day most days. It's just like going down literature rabbit holes, reading books, tangential studies as well. Like I've done extensive coursework in astroherbalism and astrology, and I'm now doing some coursework in human design. And I can see how all the threads connect as well, which is actually really, really cool. And I'm excited to do some more work on that in the future and be able to present my like synthesized ideas on these things, because I've just been having like epiphany after epiphany, especially with learning human design. It's been like a real game changer. So that's kind of what has led me to where I am now. And Jack, I ended up connecting with him, having him on my podcast 3 times. And I was on Gabrielle's podcast and spilled half of the light story there. I still have to go back and finish the mitochondria story essentially. But I think, like you mentioned in the prequel to this episode, he really saw that. And I guess the way that I conveyed the information made him feel like I knew what I was talking about, and that this could be a really good synergy between us, or just a very good collaboration at some level. And so we've really connected a lot since then. I'm going to be going down to visit in like 3.5 weeks. I'm going to stay for like a week and a half, and Nicole's coming down too. And side note, so Jack connected me with Nicole Shanahan after they had connected over some funding allocation for light research in an effort to help to find solutions for her daughter Echo that has regressive autism. And so ultimately the goal, at least as it's conceptualized right now, is to start a decentralized light lab. I really don't know what that's going to necessarily look like right now, but I know based on the way all of my life up until this point is unfolded, that opportunities present themselves, and it just becomes very clear which one is the right direction to go. And so that's kind of how things have been unfolding in that direction too. And I'm really excited to see where it goes. Honestly, it's kind of like a page turner here. I don't really know where things are going. I'm just literally along for the ride. But it's very, very exciting and absolutely life-changing work. Like my entire life has changed since finding this work. Not only like my health, my energy levels, my sleep quality, my critical thinking, my creativity, but also the people I surround myself with, the conversations that I'm having, just the quality of relationships as well. Like everything has transformed since falling down this like light water magnetism rabbit hole. And so I'm just like eternally grateful for Jack's work. It's just, I just want everybody to know about it and be able to level up in these ways.
Ooh, man, lots of threads I could pull there. But the main one I want to touch on is the light lab. There's when you say that you've been researching 6 to 8 hours a day, it's from like centralized, sources where you have to kind of derive conclusions that feed the decentralized paradigm that we're building. But there hasn't been direct questions that we'd want answered. And we kind of have to put the pieces together. It's kind of a puzzle. Like for your light lab, in your it's a page turner, right? We don't know where it's going, but in your mind, what are, I guess, the more pertinent questions that you want to directly answer? Like if you're looking through this literature where not a single study is looking at full spectrum light in the picture, it's all artificial. It's an incomplete picture, like UV light in isolation, for example. There's like, man, I wish a study looked at this with these factors and see how light interacted in this way. I guess, what are some ideas, some hypotheses that come to your mind in the first few years of this light lab that's being birthed?
Yeah. So we, as Jack talks about a lot, there's no light controls in any studies. So like we can repeat a whole bunch of studies that have already been done in just like artificial indoor lab environments that we could do under natural light. And so like we could imagine having a room, like let's say a mouse room that has like quartz glass ceilings, for example, so that full spectrum light can come through to provide that. Obviously, mice are also nocturnal, so they are different from us. They're, they also have hair. So like we as humans are completely different. And it should make complete sense that we actually need more sun and not less, as like the centralized propaganda would say, because if we were supposed to be protecting ourselves from the sun, then we wouldn't have lost hair as a species. Like, it literally doesn't even make sense because hair is protective against solar rays. The melanin in the hair absorbs them and kind of blunts the total amount that's absorbed into the body. So there's work that needs to be done there with regards to light controls. Some initial studies that I would really like to do, since Gabrielle is such a good friend of mine, is looking at things like bed rest studies and seeing if people lose considerably less muscle if they're under natural light versus under artificial lights on bed rest. And if
Mm.
you look at a lot of the old hospitals, they had like sunning decks on the roof. The patients would get wheeled up there. This is like not new things, but it's just in our ignorance and hubris, we've kind of just assumed that light doesn't matter. And as a result, we're also developing tech in the lighting space and in like the like device screens, etc. That is like the antithesis of what we want from a healing perspective and from a circadian perspective as well, and mitochondrial perspective in general. So some initial studies that would be really cool is either leveraging red and infrared light or full spectrum sunlight on immobilized limbs, for example, or people who are on bed rest or in casts and things like that, and seeing if we can mitigate the amount of muscle loss by leveraging light. That's a really cool one. Also, just looking in general at I think at mitochondria too. So like something that's really interesting to think about is like the plasticity of more uncoupled mitochondrial haplotypes. So the coupled mitochondria are like the most ancestral ones. They're kind of from the breadbasket of humanity in West Africa. And then as people migrated north, those mitochondria started shapeshifting into the more uncoupled mitochondrial haplotype that's able to better make heat in response to cold weather. And that's, of course, adaptive because if you're living somewhere that has harsh winters, you need to be able to maintain your core body temperature. And you can do that by having these mitochondria generating heat. But as Jack talks about, there's a lot of plasticity here in these uncoupled mitochondria because, for example, you can put somebody with Irish or Scandinavian ancestry with light skin and light eyes, and you can put them in a more equatorial climate, and over time they can build that solar callus, they can build melanin and darken their skin. Now, what we would also love to see is like at the level of their mitochondria, do their mitochondria also look more coupled? Because that's what his research would suggest, and it also makes sense that they would have some level of plasticity because the uncoupled mitochondria came from the coupled mitochondria ultimately. So the fact that they can kind of shrink back down and become more coupled would actually make sense. And that's kind of what's happening at the level of the skin. The skin is looking more coupled. Of course, it's not going to get as dark as somebody from Nairobi, but it can get much darker than what their baseline skin tone would be without any sunlight inputs. So I think that's really interesting. I think we also need a ton more research on melanin biology, and the importance of cultivating melanin on the surfaces in order to support melanin inside. These studies are going to be a little trickier because we're going to need to figure out a way to trace or track melanin and basically follow where it goes,
Mm-hmm.
which I think we're going to have to get super creative about. But again, I don't think any question we want to ask, I think we can ultimately do it. It's just a matter of time, funds, and creativity. But the notion is that melanocytes stem from neuroectoderm, which is like a tissue type that forms during development, and that neuroectoderm derivative cells are able to basically migrate in the body. So the idea is if you cultivate melanin on your surface and then it becomes wintertime or you go into a very oxidative environment, that melanin can be pulled inside and used to protect your internal organs, for example, or your brain from oxidative stress damage in the absence of full spectrum sunlight or in the presence of a lot of non-native EMFs or harsh radiation, like in a plane, for example. And on the Rick Rubin podcast, Rick says something like, I have this tan and then I go on a long flight and my skin is paler by the end of the flight, alluding to the fact that this is a phenomenon that people are seeing, but what is actually happening with the melanin? Where's it going? And we know that melanin is this really powerful sponge for free radicals. It's also a really powerful way to directly harness free energy from the sunlight via water splitting. And so we need to look way more into human photosynthesis, the role that plays. We need to absolutely study obesity in the context of UV light and full spectrum sunlight, because I think that's like going to be a huge buy-in for people. A lot of people just really want to lose weight, and Ozempic is, I think, in a few years, it's going to be really clear that there's a lot of trade-offs for using the GLP-1 agonists in general, whether it's neuroendocrine tumors, like Jack says, or a lot of rebound weight gain post using it or other issues as well. So the more that we can get good, solid research on leveraging light for healthy body composition, healthy muscle mass, lowering body fat and maintaining low body fat or healthy body fat amounts, these would all be like very low hanging fruit from like a societal perspective. There's a lot of energy being put towards this area, and it's also very interesting from a scientific perspective too. And when we learn about POMC, that whole POMC pathway and the leptin melanocortin pathway, the melanocortins being like there's a subset of receptors, MC1R through MC5R, and these receptors are the receptors for the alpha, beta, and gamma MSH molecules that are cleaved from POMC in response to UVB light. And so those melanocortins are also directly influencing leptin. So when leptin binds to specific cells, it's transmitted in the bloodstream from the fat tissue to the brain, can activate certain cells that then send a cascade that activates that, usually the MC4R, like the alpha MSH receptor in the hypothalamus, that decreases appetite and increases energy expenditure, which is what you're looking for if you're trying to maintain a healthy body composition or lose weight. And so I think we really need to study that more. We also need to study the effects of artificial light and blue light in particular on the leptin melanocortin pathway and just really get clear cut data in humans that is like,
Yeah.
I mean, the hypotheses are very cut and dry right now, and it's in a first principles sense. We don't really need to prove it, but from the centralized perspective, we can have proof. We can just, I don't want to call it proof. We can share the evidence that this is actually the case, and then that can ultimately hopefully shape policy. And I'm especially hopeful that that's possible with Trump and Kennedy getting in, and Kennedy being able to clear house in the FDA and CDC and actually basically set a precedent for doing real science again and stop with the propaganda, stop with the quick fixes and the drugs to numb symptoms instead of dealing with root issues. And so I am hopeful that we can actually make some progress in that front, especially because I'm directly connected with Nicole now. So it's like very, very feasible that I could actually have a decent amount of ability to influence policy or science at a high level as well. So I'm super excited about that. It seems like there's just kind of an endless potential, but those are some of the main experiments that I'm really interested in doing right off the bat. It's like human photosynthesis and melanin, light controls in the context of obesity and metabolic health, in the context of muscle health. I think these would be some of the really, really great experiments to do in the beginning. But in the meantime, actually, Nicole and I are working on a project together on crystals. So using Vogel crystals and other crystals in order to generate light de novo. Basically, Marcel Vogel's work, he worked for IBM for like 30 years developing the LCD screen technologies. And when he retired, he started working full time in like his own lab and working with crystals, the so-called Vogel crystals, and basically found that if you vortex water around these crystals, that UV light gets created, UV photons get created within the water. And so we want to see if we can, first of all, recapitulate those results and then see if we can, increase UV light yield depending on different crystals being used or different cuts or different sided crystals. And then if we can use some sort of a crystalline technology to actually help provide more solar yield or UV light yield to the body in the context of like wintertime or chronic disease where we need more UV light to facilitate the healing process. If we could leverage crystals instead, because the body is mostly water, like on a molecular basis. And so if we could leverage crystals to make UV light inside in a similar way that like cold does, when you do a cold plunge, it makes more UV biophotons inside via the mitochondria. If we could leverage crystals as well, then, Jack says, we wouldn't necessarily have to tell people to move to the equator now if they need to heal, but maybe we could develop a technology that gives them access to those healing light frequencies. And then, that could just be a complete game changer, essentially.
You got a wide range that you just described.
Yeah.
Basic hypotheses to crystals.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because you said you'd mention in your recent Danny Jones podcast, you're taking a training by Dr. Robert Gilbert.
Yes.
And is it a course or is he just teaching you?
It's a
personally?
course. I would love to connect with him directly after
You
this.
should,
I
yeah.
want to get a bit more familiar with his work first and take his courses that are like evergreen and really get a good idea of that work. And then I'll be able to be more informed to approach him and like maybe request direct mentorship or at least start to connect with him. Because I think that he'll bring a perspective that's very unique and would be a great add-on to everything else that we're working on.
It's that side that he's on, and him and Dr. Kareem. It's so interesting. I wish it could be translated into this left brain uh quantitative science, but that's hard because it's also qualitative, you know,
It is.
the
But I'm
the
also hopeful
colors.
about that because I mean, in my human design, I have a lot of like the gates and channels that really help me to translate information into way like people that can just understand me. And
Yeah.
actually, it's really interesting, but like so when I had my reading with my current teacher Sam, she was telling me how basically when I say things, people don't question me, which is kind of interesting because actually I don't get much pushback at all, honestly. And in contrast, we were contrasting that with my partner's body graph, and she was saying like he has to prove himself constantly and you just don't for whatever reason, the way you're communicating, it's just like people get it. And so I'm hopeful that I'll be able to, I really think I'll be able to merge to a certain extent, you know, the biogeometry and the crystal stuff with like the hard science and like my academic background. I think
Hmm.
always it kind of really seems like I'm just collecting puzzle pieces and then I'm trying to figure out how to fit them together and like things click and like that's what I've been experiencing when I was studying the crystals and the biogeometry as well as the astrology and the human design. It's like little pieces are clicking in with the other framework I've already built, and it's really awesome. It's very also unique. I don't know anybody else that's connecting dots like this. Most people who are into the hard sciences are not into the esoteric whatsoever or the subtle energies, but I think it's an absolute mistake. Especially if you look at like our scientific forefathers, the vast majority of them were involved in the esoteric in some way, whether it was alchemy or whether it was, you know, other types of more esoteric teachings and practices. There was a lot of overlap there, and modern science is like completely soulless. It's just completely devoid of any sort of subtle energies or vitalism, so to speak.
Hmm. Shout out Dr. Becker. He
Heck yeah.
recapitulated that in the body electric. That's so interesting because when you're talking about crystal, that makes the n equals one more complex because now you're having to deal with intention and I guess like the purity of heart. And that could be a disclaimer in your studies, like you have to be pure. You have to be a good person to make this crystal work.
It's a good
Um,
filtration mechanism.
that's true, yeah. Just adds another dimension to scientific study, and it's just fascinating the way you're gonna tie it all together.
Totally. I mean, we have examples of that already in like just working with animals. We know that if you're
Mhm.
nervous working with an animal, the data can change, especially if you're working in metabolism because things are just very like finicky. They're very nuanced and like even a small stressor can completely change glucose and lactate metabolism, for example, and in the mice and also in humans. And so there's that aspect. We also know that men working with male mice, they create a stress response in the male mice, whether it's through pheromones or somehow they can sense like the testosterone in the males, and it's like a they sense like a power clash or something. So there's lots of like nuance even within the centralized medicine and science that's not really discussed, but it's known colloquially or like, you know, on the side within labs. Like we're talking about these types of things, like the stress response and mitigating that, but nobody's talking about light, of course, which is a major stressor, especially when it's in the form of fluorescent bulbs. And actually, this reminds me of a story that I like to tell with regards to my time at Princeton, which was I was doing some circadian studies back then, and I had to go and check on my mice at like 2 a.m. And when I went into the mouse room at 2 a.m., I could only turn on red lights because they knew that from a circadian perspective, you would mess up their circadian rhythms if you turn on bright lights at 2 a.m. And then I would do what I need to do. I'd go back to my lab where I'm blasting myself with bright lights at 2 a.m. Like, not like the disconnect is just so vast. There's so much cognitive dissonance within the centralized model, especially within circadian research and also just like health research in general, translational science, that I just found amusing when I started stumbling down this light rabbit hole because it's just like we're just totally missing the mark at some level.
It makes me think of how, like, when you think of science and scientists, academia, when you're describing all this nuance, it's presented like it's iron fact, like this
Yeah,
steel truth. But you're, as a scientist, you've already experienced there's a lot of factors that could influence what you see on the paper. And then we take the paper as this holy grail. Oh, this is pure objective data.
oh yeah,
And what's the word? Prepositional. A lot of it is prepositional, you know, but it's taken rigidly and you got to take it more loosely and paint a directional picture rather than this paradigm that's really hard, sticky. And I think Jack does that really well,
I agree. I
taking all
agree.
that centralized stuff and making that picture the what's the painting he's painting with like the pieces he's been dealt. It's masterful, I think.
It really is. Also, it's making me think, like earlier, I corrected myself when I said proof and I changed it to evidence because there is
Yeah.
no scientific proof. We're always just, compiling evidence essentially towards a model, and that model is not
Mm.
fixed. It's not final. It's always being evolved upon because our senses are very limited. Our five senses are limited. That's all we're really observing reality. So we're only ever approaching reality. We can never actually, say this is what's happening. We're kind of approximating that. And that's why certain social media personalities really just irk me to no end, especially in like the medical space. And like, there's one guy in particular, I don't need to say his name, but his podcast is called The Proof. And every time I see his face, I just want to punch it. Because I'm like, there is no proof in science. And he literally has a master's degree in like something like physical therapy or something. And he's out here spouting about nutrition and veganism and just all of this dogmatic BS that is basically backed up by studies that are first of all cherry picked, and they're also very biased in their approaches. And so that's just also the rub, is that there's not a lot of good literature on certain topics. For example, lipids and lipid metabolism. We're just like clinging on to this LDL hypothesis for dear life, not understanding that like high LDL cholesterol can be a canary in the coal mine, but sometimes it's like not doing anything at all. And because we're not even looking at this N=1 context, we've conflated science and medicine like it's this pipeline. But in medicine, it should be a complete N=1 context where the doctor is getting to know you and your body. And, there's some trial and error aspect to that. And this is how medicine used to be practiced. And it's like being able to detect patterns really well, essentially, and also get to know the person in front of you. We're completely devoid of that now in modern medicine. It's like everything is on the electronic medical record. There's not even like a genuine connection between the doctor and the patient. And in science, in translational science, we're looking at the averages across populations. We're not looking at what happens at the individual level. And so when you take an average of a population, that average may not apply to one individual within that population. It's just you're taking the average of everybody. So the outliers are actually the most interesting data points, because that's like what's going on in these individuals. Like it's clearly biologically relevant, but we're literally going to use statistics to eliminate outliers because it makes the data more pretty and more significant,
Yeah.
statistically speaking. So it's very skewed, and like honestly, just it's not suited to basically make medicine more successful or more like better therapeutic value. We're kind of having the opposite effect, where we're trying to pigeonhole people into boxes that don't necessarily fit them, and then with drugs that have a whole slew of side effects that they can get other drugs that gives you more side effects. And it's just like this whole clusterfuck that we've created. And we just need to, that's why I really like the light story too, because it's very empowering. It's very centering and grounding, and it can give you just a bit more clarity to be able to see things more clearly and see reality more for what it is. Then you can make better choices and be able to have better discernment. And so I think that's why I also really like to focus on the light story first, because from that point you gain a little bit of momentum that allows you to create a life that you actually want to live, versus being on this hamster wheel of the pharmaceutical medical industrial complex, essentially.
Yeah, there's the light story is interesting because you say N=1, you gotta really taper the approach to each person. However, the matrix has gotten so ubiquitous that one directional correction would improve most people, generally speaking. Like, for example, turning off blue light at night. Like, yes, it's N=1, but that one thing, switching your nights from blue light to pitch black, would be widely beneficial. And that's not something that's N=1 restricted. Perhaps in its scope of effect, it could be varied, but directionally, it would have a huge foundational benefit. And so that's why I love the light story, because it's this mix of logic, observation, and science. They kind of have to put together through the literature, through nature, through your own direct experience, through just reasoning, and that
Mm.
you can kind of just see for yourself. And like you mentioned, we got to become our own doctors, stop outsourcing our power and just really be Sherlock Holmes. And this is a great starter for everyone. So I'm just going to have you do what you do best, tell the light story in the way that, yes, N=1, super specific, but it's the widest casting net, that specificity, that it's beneficial. How would you portray it to people and that they get it and that light bulb flips on for them.
Yeah, I mean, so just going back to what you said briefly, there's inputs that are required as Homo sapiens. Like there's just
Hmm.
specific inputs that we need. And that shouldn't require a randomized clinical control study. As Jack says, nature is not subject to randomized control clinical trials because nature is actually what we were, designed to be in, what we evolved in, what shaped our biology. And so using first principles and logic, you can deduce as
Uh-huh.
diurnal mammals, we require light from the sun during the day and darkness at night. That's just the way it
Hmm.
is. And depending on where your maternal ancestors came from in particular, kind of dictates what environment you may thrive more in, because of course, the more north you go, the more dramatic the seasons get. So like you have cold winters and less sun during the winter, and you get, more light during the summer times in the more northern latitudes versus at the equator, you have light stability with pretty consistent UV light. You could get wet and dry seasons, but UV light is pretty high year round. And you're getting like 12 hours of light a day. So depending on your skin tone / your maternal ancestry, which dictates where your mitochondria came from, that can kind of suggest what part of the world you could thrive best in. But even then, I think there's some wiggle room, especially for uncoupled mitochondria haplotypes from more northern regions. I think they could probably get away with living just about anywhere. I think for people with darker skin who also have mitochondria from more equatorial regions, it can be very challenging to create and sustain health at a more very north latitude, like somebody from Nairobi, Kenya being in Sweden, for example. Like, I think this is
Hmm.
really hard to maintain over the long term. Of course, you can make sacrifices in the short to medium term, depending on what your goals are, but ultimately, we really need high quality sun in order for darker skin to really unleash its power with regards to its ability to harness free energy from the sun. And also, of course, create vitamin D and POMC, which is via UVB light. And because melanin is this sponge for all wavelengths of light, if the light quality is poor where you're living, then there's not enough light spillover that allows vitamin D to be made, or POMC, for example. And so we, in certain people really need to think about what light environment and what environment in general would be best for them in the long term. And then in the short term, if there's somewhere that's suboptimal, how can we bioharmonize to create less trade-offs, let's say. But with regards to the light story, I mean, the most important thing I mentioned is bright light during the day from the sun and darkness at night. Like, as diurnal creatures that have a circadian rhythm, those are the two most important inputs for the maintenance of that circadian rhythm, which is a 24-hour cycle within the body. And that bright light really needs to be from the sun, because if you look at the lux from indoor light sources, so midday sun could be up to 300,000 lux. Max you're going to receive indoors, even from a pretty bright light, is about 1,000, and most are like about 500 or less. So that bright light during the day is often missing in most people who live a perpetually indoor lifestyle. That bright light is really important for stimulating the production of serotonin, also just stimulating the nervous system in general, improving cognition, and anchoring in the day portion of the circadian rhythm. Then, of course, at nighttime, that darkness is required to convert that serotonin into melatonin. That melatonin can be released, that can help you fall asleep, stay asleep, and get good quality sleep. It also bathes all your tissues, which helps to set the peripheral clock. So we have the master clock that's connected to the retina. It's called the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The retina basically senses blue light from the environment. Midday sun is about 25% blue light, over 50% red and infrared light. We'll get into why that's important in a little bit. But that blue light sends the signal to the brain that it's the middle of the day. That master clock then says, okay, it's midday. There are certain functions that go along with it being midday, which include digestion, movement, cognition, things like this. When the light goes down, when it becomes dark out, then the body shifts into producing that melatonin, and basically the body and the brain now understand that it's nighttime. And at nighttime, there are different functions that need to be prioritized. Those include sleep, recovery, regeneration, wound healing, tissue turnover, and cellular turnover. So these functions are associated with the nighttime. And if you're never actually giving your body the input of darkness, which most people aren't, because they'll be on their phones before bed, they'll have their TVs on. Some people even sleep with the TV on. Some people will sleep with night lights on, or even like actual lights on as well. And so if you're never getting that dark signal into the body, you're never harnessing and accessing those regenerative processes that occur only when it's dark out. And so we already know, just like at a basic level, people understand that if you deprive them of sleep, that, you're basically your metabolism and your cognition and everything kind of goes to shit over the course of a few days. Like you really can't sustain without any sleep at all. Like I think the most has been maybe like a week, and people start getting like psychosis and things like that. So we really know that we have this debt to pay in being unconscious in order to be conscious. And if we aren't paying back that debt nightly in a really mindful way and with long enough duration and quality, that we're going to pay a toll for that during our normal waking consciousness, whether it's more anxiety, more depression, mood dysregulation, poor digestion and digestive health issues, discomfort, issues with cardiovascular health and insulin resistance. All of these things are associated with dysregulated circadian rhythms. So outside of that, we have light and dark. Within the light, we have to kind of zoom in because the modern light environment is completely different from the ancestral light environment. The modern light environment basically consists of device screens, our phones, tablets, computers, TVs, and energy efficient light bulbs in the form of LED and fluorescent tube bulbs. And all of these light sources, from the devices to the energy efficient bulbs, are highly enriched in blue light and devoid of red and infrared light. And that's because infrared light is seen as a waste product because it doesn't contribute to the brightness of the light. And infrared light is also known as heat. And heat is seen as this, it's not only basically a waste because it's not contributing to brightness, but it can also break down, the mechanics of tech devices essentially more rapidly because the heat can create more entropy, I guess, technically. So that's a problem because we're not understanding that infrared light is actually an essential nutrient and essential input into human biology. No matter what time of year it is, even if it's the dead of winter, when the sun is up, there is infrared light present. And that's what allows sun to feel warm. That's also what makes fire feel warm when you're sitting in front of it, is this immense amount of infrared light being given off. It's also what made incandescent bulbs get hot, and was the reason why they were a fire hazard if you threw like a towel over the lamp with the incandescent bulb, because they give off a lot of infrared light, which you cannot see with your eyes, but if you use an infrared camera, you can see it coming off the bulbs. You can also see it coming off our bodies because we also emit and produce quite a bit of infrared light. As endotherms, we have to maintain our core body temperature. Our mitochondria make a ton of metabolic heat, infrared light biophotons, that help to maintain that core body temperature. Fun fact, those mitochondria will also make UV biophotons, which goes all the way back decades to Fritz Popp's work on UV biophoton biology and where it's being made in cells and what it's doing there. So we know also when you stimulate mitochondria, let's say via cold exposure and cold water immersion, that you're also making a ton more light, not only infrared light to heat your tissues up, but also UV light. And that's why Jack talks a lot about leveraging cold as a way to build your melanin inside, because you're basically making that light internally, and that can stimulate the production of melanin. And this UV light is actually even stronger than the light from the sun. It is within the VUV range, which is like in the UVC range, which is not what we receive from the sun. Sunlight is just UVB and UVA. The UVC is too short of a wavelength to get through the atmosphere. So we have this absence of red and infrared light in our indoor environments for the reasons I just described. We also have the absence of UV light in our indoor environments, primarily because it's been demonized and thought of as this toxic thing that you have to protect yourself from. Slap the sunscreen, wear sunglasses, wear prescription lenses or contact lenses that block UV light. If you go outside, you need to be protected or cover up or whatever. And inside, we have all of our window glass that's not only blocking infrared light as a way to maintain the temperatures of our indoor environments more easily, because we don't want that heat coming in and warming up the environment and making the thermostat kick on or whatever. But window glass also blocks 100% of UVB light and about 30% of UVA light. And so in effect, what you're doing is, even if you're sitting behind glass without any tech on or lights on, you're effectively concentrating blue light because you're removing the UV and the infrared that actually balances out the effects of blue. So as it turns out, red and infrared light directly stimulate the mitochondria to make more energy and more metabolic water and improves mitochondrial health and function. Blue light actually has the opposite effect. So when blue light interacts with the mitochondria on your surfaces, including your skin, eyes, and proximal brain regions, it actually impairs mitochondrial function. And that's why in nature, you will never encounter blue light without an abundance of red and infrared light because of this balancing effect. Like I said, midday sun is about 25% blue light, over 50% red and infrared light. So inside, we're really encountering this alien sun environment, and Jack makes a comparison to the KT event, which took out the dinosaurs, where basically all this ash got kicked up, or debris got kicked up into the atmosphere that changed the spectrum of sunlight that was able to reach the ground. which cause mass die-off of different plants and large megafauna, because they need a lot of solar energy and plant energy in order to sustain their function. And we're essentially doing it to ourselves through not only the alien light environments we're creating inside, but also all of the weather manipulation that we're doing that's supposedly not approved, like SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection, supposedly not approved. But I actually have a PubMed paper that I posted about a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, talking about how there is a paper trail showing it is being used. And I was actually just posting a lot about it today because this morning, up through just before I hopped on this podcast with you, the entire sky was just riddled with chemtrails, like terrible. And it's a chemtrail because it's there for hours and it spreads out, and like they literally spray so like goes over the sun. So there's like a haze, you can kind of see it. There's like a
I see it.
super awful haze that's like all over the sky. It makes the sky look hideous, and it makes the sun not feel warm. It's like reflecting some of that infrared light back out into space, essentially. And the notion behind that is to prevent global warming or slow down global warming. But again, we're having this disconnect between reality and propaganda, essentially. Like, there are certain inputs our bodies need. UV and infrared light are arguably the most important light spectrum, pieces of the light spectrum that are required for human bioenergetics. The infrared light runs our mitochondria. The UV light helps to structure water along with the infrared light, help that create that fourth phase exclusion zone water that facilitates metabolism. People think about ATP being this energy currency, but it's actually the water. The ATP just unlocks the enzymes to allow that water to get in there. The structured water is literally serving as a battery that's powering metabolism. And we have this epidemic in loss of exclusion zone water because we don't engage in any of the exposures that we need to actually build it, which includes far infrared light, 3100 nanometer light from the sun, as well as ultraviolet light. And so this is essentially creating a bioenergetic crisis. And that's why I like to say energy efficiency and technology is creating an energy crisis in the human body, because we're not understanding that these inputs are actually like essential nutrients. That's the way we have to think about it. We think about essential nutrients within the context of nutrition, but our light nutrition is just as important, if not more important, as our like dietary nutrients, because the light is actually setting your metabolic rate and your ability to process nutrients coming in through the diet, and your appetite, and your metabolic health overall. So if you're eating a perfect diet, but you're sitting inside under junk light all day and you're never getting out into the sun and getting that infrared and UV light, you're going to have health issues. There's no way around it. You could be exercising in a gym and eating a perfect diet, and you're going to have issues if you don't bring in the light piece, because it's so foundational. It's at the base of this pyramid of health. It regulates everything downstream. UV light and light in general also help to support mitochondrial function in muscle, helps to mobilize fat from fat tissue so it can go into muscle and support muscle energy metabolism. UVA light is a primary stimulus of nitric oxide production, which is crucial for muscle health, but also for cardiovascular health and vasodilation, which allows for nutrients and oxygen to be taken up by tissues and waste products to be removed from tissues. It's also very important from like a cognitive perspective too, being able to have those nutrients and oxygen delivered to the brain, which is a very metabolically demanding organ. Of course, we already mentioned the infrared and red light, which are important from a mitochondrial perspective. The near infrared portion of the infrared light spectrum can literally penetrate all the way through the body. So if you're standing outside, even if you have light clothing on, you're getting 360-degree penetration by near infrared light. In effect, you're stimulating all of the mitochondria within your body. It can even go through bone. And so that's another really big issue that we're facing, is that in the near infrared part of the spectrum in particular, we're meant to be receiving that all day long, because even if you're sitting outside in the shade, green plants reflect a ton of near infrared light. So even sitting in the shade, you're bathing your body and your mitochondria in near infrared light. But if you're sitting inside with your windows shut, you're not getting any near infrared light. If you have your LED lights on, like, there's no incandescent bulbs because they already started being banned in 2013. The final ban is enacted in 2028 if nothing changes. So there's no source of infrared light inside the home unless windows and doors are open. And so this is arguably one of the bigger deficits that we're facing. Like, the UV light is, I would say, equally important in other ways, but our bodies do have ways to make UV light internally, for example, through getting cold. And that should also make sense because when it's wintertime and it's cold out, there's no UV light. So the biology adapted to be able to make its own UV light in the absence of UV light from the sun. And so if we're getting cold, and we're sitting inside, as long as we're adding near infrared light back in, that can offset some of the harms that we're going to be getting from, completely not getting any UV light internally or externally. But we're really meant to be living within the seasons because that allows our bodies to be exquisitely tuned metabolically and endocrine system wise as well, hormonally, to the environment, and allows you to basically thrive optimally within that environment. But most people are sitting indoors at 70 to 75 degrees year round with no infrared light, no UV light. And now we're really facing an issue there because we're not supplementing that through cold and being able to increase our own infrared and UV light production. And so there's like just this disconnect here where we're missing these essential nutrients in the form of light, and basically nobody's talking about it. And so that's why I just am really passionate about sharing the information, because it's also pretty quick fixes. Like most of it's free as well. Just getting outside more, getting your bare feet on some grass somewhere, just having naked eyes and as much skin as possible exposed to some midday sun. Getting out at sunrise into that UVA rise period of time is amazing from a mitochondrial and a circadian perspective. And then just blocking blue light at night and turning off as much lights as possible, whether you're using red bulbs or wearing blue blockers. Ideally, using like filters on your screen starting in the nighttime and also arguably all day. Like I use an amber filter on my screen all day. If I'm going to be somewhere that I can't control the light environment, I'll wear my blue blockers at night. Otherwise, my house like has red bulbs everywhere. So if we need light at night, we're going to put on that. And then you're going to naturally get sleepy earlier, and you're going to fall asleep, and you're going to have better quality sleep. And you're going to naturally wake up earlier because you're going to get better quality sleep, and you're just going to naturally start to sync up with the rhythms of the sun. And when the sun rises, you're going to just feel naturally like you want to get up around then. And so the cycle can continue more effortlessly. So the first thing that people should do is really just, when the sun starts going down, to religiously block blue light and put filters on your screens and use red bulbs if possible. And then that's naturally going to put you on this rhythm where you get tired earlier. You're going to fall asleep and stay asleep more easily, and you're going to naturally wake up earlier. And that's going to help you put yourself on this rhythm that will then beget more health and more change and momentum that allows you to build the energy to actually implement some other lifestyle and other factors that can help to improve your health overall.
Boom. That's it, you guys. That's all you need. That's everything. All right. Podcast is done. Let me I'm gonna try to recapitulate everything you said in a broad brush stroke. What comes to mind is when you're saying all those granular details is there's this paper by Doug Wallace. It says etiology in it. Etiology of disease, bioenergetics, something along those lines. And he essentially lays out the fact that high heteroplasmy and low bioenergetics from damaged mitochondria is what precedes a lot of chronic disease. And so in the centralized paradigm, it's genetics, it's unfortunate fate, and it's not controllable. But what Alexis just laid out is, in order to prevent that from happening, there are key inputs such as red light, near infrared light, and UV light, all of which improves bioenergetics. If you put it simply, UV light doing that by regulating autophagy, apoptosis, increasing POMC byproducts. Red light, you'll see the photobiomodulation literature. It's like they're all saying, gee whiz, this red light is miraculous. There's so much good effects, so many studies on it. But you just realize that it's all done in this blue lit lab with a lot of mal-illuminated individuals who have no red light in the first place. They're kind of seeing something that, like you said, is already the case in nature. So you have that whole field of literature proving that red light is good for bioenergetics. You have UV light, POMC biology. So if you just put the two together, Doug Wallace said this, bad mitochondria precedes chronic disease, and you need these inputs to keep your mitochondria good. Light is the central part of the story, hence why we're banging this drum as much as we can, and in as many ways as we can. Helps to listen to many voices at different angles, and it finally will click. Funny story. When I got red pilled into light, this is hilarious. I got red pilled into light. It was at night, and there was blue lights coming from the street lights. It was literally under blue light. My red pill moment happened, and I was reading this like, holy shit.
It's everywhere. It's
Yeah.
everywhere. I know
Uh-huh.
you can't unsee it. You cannot unsee it once you see it. And the thing is also, once you start implementing these practices like blocking blue light at night and getting sun during the day, you also build back your photoreceptor density, like the melanopsin receptors on your skin and eyes and your retina. This blue light detector that's involved in the circadian mechanism. It's also in your subcutaneous fat. The problem is when you're in a lot of artificial light in the absence of that red and infrared light, you can start to break down those photoreceptors because they're basically being hyperstimulated. That also frees vitamin A retinal form, and that can go on to break down more photoreceptors. So it kind of creates this cascade. Once you start implementing these principles, you can build back your photoreceptor density, and then you become way more sensitive to artificial light, like especially at
Mm.
night. I personally like I literally can't have it on me. I feel like it's almost painful to have, especially onto my eyes, any form of like unadulterated artificial light from like a phone or a TV or like lights in like a basketball
Yeah.
arena, things like that. It's just like I always am packing my daytime blue blockers and my nighttime blue blockers on me at all times in case I need them because your sensitivity does really build back. And in general, I feel like your sensitivity builds back not only from that light perspective, but also like intuitively well. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
my intuition has been very exquisitely like tuned to my new biological state where it's like I get downloads very easily. I get I think I have like better discernment, I would say. Like I can sense subtle energies more. And so it makes actually navigating life a lot easier too, because now your mind isn't the one really driving the show. Like mind is really not supposed to be the one driving the show either. And this, of course, is part of the human design story too, but I'm an emotional authority in human design. So I have these waves of knowing, and I'm supposed to wait to have clarity, which is something I always had done anyways. And then I can basically understand like when a wave is coming, if I'm experiencing clarity, it's very obvious that it's there versus in the past, especially when I was still on birth control, I was like so detached from that inner knowing. It was just really kind of floundering around and kind of making poor decisions and learning as a result of that versus being able to be in touch with that voice that's like, this is for you, this is not for you, choose this, not that. That voice has really been amplified throughout this journey. And that's like a really kind of unsung part of the story as well. Like there's like a very significant spiritual aspect and like spiritual growth aspect that comes as a part of tuning in with nature and getting outside more and um, just realizing that we actually are nature and you can't separate us from that system. And just getting back in touch with that, it just gives you access to this wellspring of information that was otherwise unavailable when we're kind of plugged into the pseudo matrix instead of the actual matrix.
Mm. Pseudo matrix. That's a good way to think about it. Nature is its own matrix for sure. Hmm.
Totally.
So you interviewed Dr. Madhavasetti. He's a big fan of the law of one. This is where my mind goes when you say intuition. The law of one, this is my main uh, grievance or disagreement with quantum biology in general. It's still it's still a little mechanical for me. It
Mhm.
doesn't incorporate qualitative like things such as your experience, emotions, etc. It's physical body oriented and in the best way. Like if you're just going to focus on the physical body like Western medicine does, quantum biology does that in the most impactful way possible. Whereas Western medicine, it just doesn't. It's they call it allopathy. It's you could see it as contropathy too. It literally tries to contradict these symptoms. But that aside, Ra, the entity in that channel work, calls it the mind body spirit complex, meaning those elements are commensurate. They're intertwined so intimately that the distinction is not even there from their point of view. So if you improve the body complex, those other two are going to start kicking in more, and like you could experience, like you said, a sharpened intuition. You just see things more, and there's this qualitative translation. That's my hypothesis. Jalal, I've interviewed him, and he has this theory that non-visual photoreceptors take in spiritual light too, like melanin and non-visual photoreceptors. Like if you have, like you said, this retinol abuse, and it's just washed away, and if you rebuild it, it literally, he thinks you're able to sensitize yourself to more like light, divine light. That's how he described it. And yeah, it just puts me into this train of thought. There's, even with quantum biology, even in its materialistic state, this quantum ultra complex machine that the body and nature runs simultaneously. At some point you have to come to the question, does this machine just run by itself, or is there something driving it? Like, even at this materialistic perspective, you have to question, is there a God here? There's some intelligence here that it's just so profound. You see the intricacy that biology is presenting to you, and you either have to conclude that this is pure chance, that these atoms are just moving randomly and it just happens to be this complex and cohesive, or there's this intelligent infinity that you just can't even fathom. From all angles, quantum biology to me, it leads you to something deeper, whether it's just your health or your spiritual life as well.
Yeah,
And
I
it's
have a ton I could
beautiful.
riff on there.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about, I mean, just at a very basic level, some people will ask me like, well, what about like the psychological or the mental emotional piece of like the health story? Like, why isn't that foundational, let's say? And whenever I get asked that question, I always make the point that if your body is regulated, you experience emotion differently. Your psyche is different. You're interfacing with it differently. And that's why, again, nailing this foundational piece gives you access to so many higher order improvements that you would have. It's kind of like non-linear. You wouldn't be able to necessarily predict it. Also, because our mechanistic understanding is always limited, I think. Also, with regards
Um,
to the photoreceptors, I really like to think about melanin and water being the two primary photoreceptors in the body.
mhm.
Water being having this immense capacity to absorb red light, infrared light. That's the primary photoreceptor for infrared light in the body. We don't have any, like, we have the options for like blue and UV light, UVA and blue light, but we don't have red ones. And that's because like water is absorbing all of that. So like we have water everywhere. There's a ton of it. We of course also in the quantum biological space and the water research space have this idea that water actually holds memory. And so if we understand it in that context, I think that's really interesting too, because, what is memory? Is that actually a form of light in some way too that's being held within cells that's just like maybe more of like a spiritual light or something like this? And that also tied really nicely into my human design studies because Ra, who's I think a different Ra, so
It is a different
name
raw,
was like
yeah.
Robert Krakauer, but then his name after he channeled human design was like Ra Uru Hu. But anyway, he described his experience. It was like an 8-day period of time where he described like all of the water was pulled out of his body and then it was infused back in with the information. That's the way he described it.
Wow.
Um,
Oh,
and in
wow.
human, I know it's wild. And also in human design, he describes crystals of consciousness that are what allows the neutrino streams from the sun and from other planets that are basically flowing through these crystals that is resulting in our experience of reality. And that also ties in pretty nicely with Jack's work. And Jack literally talks about the crystalline structures within the brain basically being an antenna for consciousness or being an antenna through which we can perceive life. And so there's a lot of interesting ties there too with regards to the crystalline structures within cells. Like there's like a theory of microtubules as like a seed of consciousness or whatever. But I think in the mechanistic reductionist sense, the scientists are thinking that like the microtubules are creating consciousness when in reality
Yeah, yeah.
they're not. Like that's likely not the case. It's likely that they're structured in such a way that allows them to be receptive to the field of consciousness, let's say. And I
That's
think
the
when you're
instrumentation, like the
yeah.
instrument, like like the radio doesn't create the
Yeah,
station, but it harnesses it, it manifests it. It's kind of like, you could say the microtubules are the instrument for consciousness. I think that's how I would interpret that research, but
totally. And also we know that mitochondria themselves are both electromagnetic detectors and emitters. So I wouldn't be surprised as well if mitochondria are playing a really important role here with regards to receiving information from the cosmos, because we know that they're detecting basically the entire electromagnetic environment. That includes the non-native EMFs, the natural EMFs, light in general, magnetism. So there's definitely something to be had there. But at some point, we also, like, science is a tool for studying certain types of things. We really kind of need different tools or perspectives to study other things. Like, science just isn't, it isn't everything. right? Like,
Yeah.
especially the reductionist type of science. Like, for example, you couldn't basically like use enzymes and break down every cell of my body and look at the constituents. You can't understand who I am by looking at the constituents. In the same way, like you can't understand a cell just by looking at what it's made of, or a mitochondria. Like each organelle and each cell probably has its own little personality going on because they're all kind of their own thing. They're just coalescing and conspiring to create a larger organism. And so I think it's just very myopic to look at the structures and say that's what it's for, because you can't actually know what something's for just by looking at its structure necessarily. So I think there's a lot of assumptions also made within like the mechanistic reductionist approach that aren't actually fair assumptions to make. You can make some predictions about what something might be good for by looking at its shape and what it's made of, but there's likely a lot more to the story than that.
It's mistaking the map for the territory. And if you make that distinction, this is a model. This is what it looks like. This is the latest iterative map, what reality seems to be, then it's fine. But materialistic scientists will take it to be all that is and the objective fact. And that's where it's very limiting in my humble opinion. But I do
Mm-hmm.
want to I do want to bring this up with you. I've been dying to ask you this question.
What is it?
So it's funny. When we describe the light story, we appeal a lot to what we observe in nature, right? In nature, you see the sun, our ancestors did this, etc., etc. And that might be logically coherent. But then I just can't help but think that someone's going to chime in and say, oh, but that's an appeal to nature fallacy. And you're just appealing to nature. And I'm just like, okay, or you want to go that route. So I guess what would you say to someone? You're telling them the light story, and that's what they say. Like they probably wouldn't just say that, but they would probably
I
throw it
oh
in there.
I've had some people say that, and also that
Okay.
like what else? Oh, they'll also say that our ancestors only lived to 30 something years old, so that's why they didn't experience any of the the issues that we did from like sun exposure, for example, and like melanomas. But it's just
Uh-huh.
like pure falsity, because if you look at the actual data, it's if you average infant mortality into the death metrics, then it brings the average down to the 30s. But outside of that, if you look at the adult lifespan of hunter gatherers, we're like looking at between 70 up to 77 years old. Like we really haven't gained much by way of lifespan. So that's a moot point. If we look at modern medicine, it's really only solving problems that we've created through modernity.
Yeah.
All of our scientific and medical innovations and successes are really simply dealing with problems we've created. That's like the short of it. But with regards to appeal to nature, I think not everything that's natural is automatically good. They'll just say something like, oh, well, there's like toxins in certain plants, and if you eat
Yeah,
them,
yeah,
you'll
yeah.
die. But we're not talking about that at all. We're talking about the essential inputs that are required to regulate a complex system, which there are certain givens in the ancestral environment, even just before like let's say pre 1890. So we can't evolve in the span of less than 200 years. Evolution comes over the course of like hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And so the fact that our environments have changed so rapidly, that's not something we're equipped to actually deal with, especially when you understand how important the roles are for light in the regulation of our systems. And we have a ton of centralized data on that too. It's not just like that's not only based on first principles, though we could definitely make a first principles case about how sunlight is a constant in the evolutionary environment. Like I said, even if you're in the shade outside, you're getting a bunch of near infrared light that's completely absent from the indoor environment. We're also always grounded, like pre, the industrialization era, because all of our synthetic materials don't facilitate the flow of electrons. But if you're wearing any sort of natural materials like leather or cotton or things like this on your feet, you're still able to ground and be electrically connected with the earth. So certain givens that we always had throughout the history of our species up until less than 200 years ago were natural light being the primary source of light. The only other source was really firelight, which is very enriched in infrared light and very low in blue light. And grounding. Like those are all three of those are very, very consistent throughout not only humanity's history, but also every species on Earth is connected with nature in that way. And so that in combination with understanding how the specific wavelengths of light and connection to the magnetic field of the earth and the Schumann resonance and the effect of grounding on your electrical system and electron flow in combination with the effects of infrared, UV, blue light on our physiology, we have a very clear evidence stream from first principles all the way to mechanistic to show that the way that we're living now is incongruent with our biology. So it's not just an appeal to nature, it's also there's a ton to back that up, and the logic is sound, and on a first principles basis, we can really clearly map out why the way that we're living is not consistent with the way that we had been living and why that's a problem.
You basically delineated it's like a fine line here. If you use appeal to nature as an attack vector to quantum biology, you're basically taking advantage of someone's ignorance because science is studying nature. And so an appeal to nature might sound like a compelling counter argument, but like you said, we're studying nature. Nature is what is. So the distinction, like you were describing the details that come with what nature presents to us with data, observation, and just logic. It's just what is given to us. If blue light was good for us, if that's what we saw, that's what we would be concluding. But that's not the case. Well, that's more nuanced. I'm just saying. But the appeal to nature thing, it's more of a essentially by itself, it says something is good just because it's natural. Something is bad just because something is unnatural. It's ascribing this moral value based on its natural or not natural quality. And that's different from science. If Alexis describes to you the data, the mechanistic, epidemiological, etc., with proof, then that's just exercising science, which is the study of nature. And she's not just saying the sun is natural, therefore it is good, which is still a true statement. But I can see how without evidence, someone could question it on that basis. But we have the evidence. We talk about the evidence quite a bit. The evidence is intricately interwoven with this light story, but that counter argument becomes futile when you just realize it's a moral ascription, not science.
It's not really even an issue of unnatural natural because I mean you could argue human beings are natural, and if we create things, it's still nature. Like we are
Yeah.
nature, so
Still,
it's not really that's not really the issue. It's actually something I've been thinking a lot about too because in human design we're still evolving, and in 2027 we're entering a new epoch. We're moving from this collective tribal epoch of the past like 411 years that was really about institutions and centralization, funnily enough.
yeah.
And we're moving into this personal individual epoch for the, starting 2027 for the next 411 years or so, that is very focused on personal empowerment and the individual decentralization, essentially, which is
Yep.
like, I got chills when I learned that.
Yeah.
But there's this aspect of our evolution, like there's actually, so over the past million years, there's been a lot of iterations of some form of humans. So we've had Homo sapiens, we've had Neanderthals, we've had a lot of different Homo species, Homo floresiensis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's been over a dozen different types of us. And Ra Uru Hu says that basically in 2027, there's going to be a new type of human that's going to start being born because we're still evolving. Like, why would it stop? It's kind of silly to think it would have stopped, like, suddenly, right? Like, we're constantly still interacting with our environments, and there's this evolutionary process that's constantly going on in the background that's actually kind of inherent within life itself. But anyway, there's this part of human design in, like, the PHS, or the primary health system, that's called determination. And it has to do with the environment or the types of food that you do best with in order to facilitate digestion, which then facilitates your cognition. And the most recently evolved part, or not aspect, but recently evolved manifestation of determination is called indirect light, which my teacher was like, she's super interested to see as I continue learning what I think about it, because in the indirect light determination, it basically states that like these people would want to be essentially awake at night and asleep during the day, which is really interesting. Like, I mean, maybe it's possible that we could evolve, a subset of us could evolve to be more like that given the inputs that we've been creating. But at the same time, when we're thinking about evolution, there's a lot of dead ends too. So just because the evolution is happening
Yeah.
doesn't mean that being is going to be successful and not be ill and not, be able to reproduce and things like that. So I just think it's really interesting to think about, like, nature is constantly kind of tinkering and experimenting with different things, and some things work and others don't, and that doesn't make anything like unnatural or wrong. But when it comes to like the conversation of natural versus unnatural, I think it's really boils down to when it comes to like, let's say food additives or things like that. It's like, do we have the biochemistry to break it down or not?
Yeah.
Because if we don't, then that's the problem. It's not that it's unnatural that's the problem. It's the fact that it's not biocompatible and it's not
Yeah.
mimicking something our biology would have encountered at least, throughout its evolutionary time scale. So I think that's really where the nuance comes in. It's like, is our body interfacing with this thing, or this ingredient or this input in a way that it understands that information? Because ultimately, we're constantly interfacing, and our mitochondria are constantly looking for energy and information. And a lot of the issue with processed foods, honestly, is that it's basically energy that's stripped of information. All the information about like the biophotons, the light environment in which that food was grown, because they're not really foods anymore. It's like ingredients stripped from different plants or whatever products that were grown in nature, but now there's no biophotons in the food. There's no micronutrients. They're not in the right ratios. If they are there, they're synthetic. And now we're losing the information that allows our body to actually know what is coming in. And so that's why I think one of the big problems is, and it's also kind of beyond us to a certain extent, like, do we really think that we're smart enough to be able to engineer food that's actually able to be interpreted as food by our bodies? Like, I don't know if we'll ever get there. I honestly don't. And I don't think we need to either. We should just be able to say, we're eating a seasonal diet. Like, I shouldn't have to like test this in a lab. We're eating a seasonal
Yeah.
diet because on first principles, certain foods grow at certain latitudes at certain times of year. And if we eat those foods, it helps to support our mitochondria in our bodies to function better in that environment. And that just makes sense at a basic level, especially because if we even look at eating a more animal-based diet during the winter because the ground's frozen, there's no plant foods growing. That animal-based diet with more fat and protein helps our brown fat to make more metabolic heat. It helps to keep us in ketosis, which also helps the mitochondria to make more heat, which maintains our core body temperature in the face of cold, versus in the summertime when more plant foods are growing. And we're also getting more deuterium from those foods, that we're also sweating and we're moving and we're getting high quality sunlight that helps us to maintain deuterium levels in the body. That also helps us to process carbohydrates better, because full spectrum sunlight, in particular the red part, helps us to clear carbohydrates from the bloodstream more easily. And if we're getting more sun time during the summer, then we're going to be able to do that more rigorously throughout the day. And so there's all these threads we can pull on, because I do get people asking about seasonal eating quite a bit. And there's not one hard and fast like RCT that's going to tell you seasonal eating is
Mm-hmm.
better than not seasonal eating. But at the same time, do we really need to prove that like you shouldn't be eating a mango in Boston in the middle of the winter? It's unsustainable at just a very basic level. Not only, from a biological perspective, you could probably get away with it. But if we're really going to have an honest conversation about global warming and climate change and pollution, what's more polluting than our global supply chain? There's not much. Like, it's gotten out of control, and we've gotten used to a certain standard of living that isn't sustainable. And I think that the more we can get back to regenerative farms that are not scalable, but they're reproducible. So having regenerative farms within communities that are growing food that's available in a certain season, prioritizing eating those foods, you get more nutrient density. It's going to help make people more healthy. It's going to make them more in tune with their environment, better able to make good decisions. And it's just better obviously for the environment too, because the regenerative farms are carbon negative. They're working with the ecosystem. They're raising animals in a way that is ethical and allowing the animals to express themselves to their fullest. I think that's what we really need to, from a best case scenario standpoint, focusing on working towards a model like that is the best case for everybody involved, from us to the animals to the land to the air and the water. It's like everybody wins. How much information and data and science do we need to prove that that's the case? I think we're already there. We don't need any more evidence. We just need to execute.
You just need to see the world right in front of you. And if you can deduce it, that's awesome. Good for you. But
Well,
yeah,
that's where
this
the
is,
MK Ultra stuff comes in too, right? Like the fact that our reality's been distorted and now people are
yeah.
spending more time in the digital realm than in the real world. And meanwhile, the real world is being manipulated to all hell, and people are just like, they don't even care, or they don't see it because they're so distracted and addicted to their technology, their drugs, their alcohol, their news media or whatever it is. People are just completely detached from the real world. Most people don't even look up. And that's why I'm not even surprised when people don't even think about the weather manipulation and the chemtrail stuff, because like nobody's even looking at the sky. I feel like the only crazy person that says like the sky is falling, look, it's actually falling, and everybody's just glued on their phones.
I didn't realize you had Chicken Little up in New Jersey. uh, but this will be a good Chicken Little movie. Some
Yes.
point, people will listen. And this is funny. I don't know how much you're in contact or you're around with. I'm not saying this pejoratively at all, but I'm just gonna say it for the sake of linguistic convenience. I don't know how much you're around normies quite a
Uh-huh.
bit, but God, if people at work see this, they're gonna think I'm roasting them, but I'm not. But I'm around a lot of them. I'm listening to Jack describe this widespread conspiracy that's taken place since long ago, and it's had this deep rooted effect until now. And I'm in the middle class amongst every single person. A lot of them I see, they don't look up, they're on their phones. Their mind is kind of just elsewhere all the time. They will not believe something beyond the headline. They are averse to any opposition, any nuanced point of view. And it's really interesting because I'm around them and it's you kind of get dragged into it. I try my best not to, but I'm seeing it and it's like, man, they cannot see it. They're so preoccupied. Their bandwidth is just so restricted and taken up that there's no extra bandwidth to see beyond the horizon, beyond what's here now, beyond the next hit, the next time they clock off their shift, which they go into wherever they're at. There's blue light everywhere, right? There's just multifaceted pseudo matrix and it's interesting, very interesting seeing it in real time. It's very real. And that's why I love talking about this quantum biology thing. It's a potent attack vector for the pseudo matrix. And to me, you represent a Trojan horse
I can see
into
that.
into like centralized science themselves. We have a lot of people without academic credentials. This is not necessary, but it's just convenient that a lot of people believe it, and you do have access to experience that only PhDs and people in those graduate programs. Because you're in those programs, you have access to those experiences that are unique to y'all. There's a utility there, but if you're gonna have this artificial divide of credible sources or not, you might as well take someone from the credible circle and nuke it from the inside, right?
Yes.
So I just love that you're doing it on both ends. And I don't know, I did want to ask, you have connections. Is there any way we see you on like, would you even do, would you even do Huberman? Would you go to Peter Attia? Would you go on Dr. Rhonda Pat, like all these like centralized scientists with large platforms? Would you do it? Or is it just like, no, I don't jive with you because it's just a values thing?
Well, my petty side definitely wants to be like, no, I don't want to Huberman. But actually, Gabrielle already put Huberman onto me, and she was on his podcast a few months ago,
I
so
saw, yeah, that's why I'm
she
asking you
already
this
has
right
had
now.
me on, has me on the pipeline to go on, hopefully sometime in Q1 or Q2 next year, probably like Q2. So
Ooh,
hopefully,
that's
hopefully that
exciting.
works out. I'm really really just about getting the message out. I really don't care who I'm talking to. But I would also not be surprised if he just wouldn't have me on either. Like he
Hopefully
might
he
just
doesn't know
not
who you
want to have
are.
me on. I know, I know.
Just like, okay, this person's really smart, and he doesn't know that you're Jack's protege.
It would be so good. Oh my God, I hope it happens like that. That he's just kind of a little bit clueless about it. And he's like, oh, she's from Princeton and Penn. Like, it's gonna be great. And then I'm just like, your worst nightmare.
Well, nuked
But yeah,
his
I'm not
stand.
against. I'll talk to anybody really about this stuff, and I honestly like I give big kudos to Jack because he's been beating this drum for like 2 decades, and somehow he still shows up even though he's been gaslit and exiled at every turn up until more recently. And I mean, I just have the utmost respect for him. I also personally love his personality and his like feistiness. I think it's amazing.
Oh
He's
yeah.
some human, and especially like most people, around his age are kind of almost zapped of all their life force, and he's just so vital. He has a very young spirit to him. And I think it's just, I mean, maybe I vibe with it because I have a lot of Aries energy in my chart, but like he's very Aries and it's great. And I mean, maybe Huberman will be more open to my like more gentle feminine side and
Hmm.
delivery, possibly.
Hmm.
But I think ultimately, yeah, I'll talk to anybody. I mean, I've only been at this a year and a half, and I haven't gotten sick about talking about any of it yet. So I think I mean, I just think it's really interesting science, and it's also extremely important. And so many people are still so ignorant of it that I really don't have time to be petty, let's say.
It's time is too precious to be
Yeah, well,
petty.
I mean, especially with everything happening, like the incandescent bans coming up in 2028, just the entire shit show that is our politics and our economy, and like there's just way too much at stake to not get this information out as soon as possible to as many people as possible. Because even just making slight changes to their lifestyle, like blocking blue light at night and turning lights off at night and getting some morning sun and taking your lunch outside, can start to radically build momentum and change people's perspectives and kind of open their eyes to like how they've kind of been asleep this whole time and not really seeing things for how they are. And so that's why I think it's a really potent, um, like a vector or a gateway drug to basically opening Pandora's box.
Or centralized science.
They're dying at their own hand, really.
Oh yeah, it's
Yeah.
unsustainable, and we're living through a fourth turning. Like it's crazy. No, you cannot believe it. The election is actually 9 days now? Is
It's
there?
like 8 days? Is it next Tuesday?
Yeah,
It is.
It's next
Oh my
Tuesday.
God.
Holy shit! So
Oh
is there
my
any
God.
8 days out from the election when we're filming this? Is there anything you want to say as a pre-election message? Because if RFK gets in, cleans house, that has downstream effects for your lab, I'm sure, for science, for a lot of things.
Oh
What's
yeah.
your message for people out there who
I mean,
may
I feel like
be?
this is I mean, I think maybe every generation has that election that they think it's the most important one ever, but I think this might actually take the cake as the most
Oh
important
yeah,
election in the history of our country, maybe,
oh
because
for sure.
we're going down a very, very slippery slope with people like John Kerry saying we need to get rid of the First Amendment because it's standing in the way of lawing and like rule law and order and ruling over the people. We have threats on our Second Amendment. We have medical tyranny that we saw unfold during COVID that was at the hand of the Uniparty, essentially. And it's not. This is not really a matter of left or right, red or blue, because they're both the same. Like they're both two sides of the same coin. But Trump and Bobby, they're not part of that system. And I don't think Trump is perfect, but he also doesn't have to be. He's been around the block now. He was there for 4 years. He kind of knows what to expect now, like the way that he appointed certain people that ended up stabbing him in the back. And he saw kind of a bit of the inner mechanics of what the system is and its ability to manipulate and its ability to prevent change from being made. So I think with Bobby on his team and Tulsi and Jack, actually, there's an immense potential here to really enact widespread change that we may not get again. I really don't know. It's really hard to say. I don't want to catastrophize whatsoever, but I just see nothing but I basically don't think that another 4 years of the same is sustainable. Like inflation is out of control. Every time I go to the grocery store, it's like over $200. I go like twice a week. It's
Mm,
the amount of inflation and the cost of living for people is just astronomical. It's not sustainable. Like I don't think we can do it for another 4 years. It's going to cause riots or something. I don't know. But people, I think, are acutely aware of that. And I actually don't think this election is going to be close at all. I really don't. I think it's going to be a landslide in favor of Trump.
hmm.
But what I am worried about is that industrial complex knows that this is like the death knell to what they have going on and what they've had going on for decades. So what are they willing to do to maintain power? That's what I don't know. And we already know we had the polio vaccines and Operation Northwoods and 9/11 and COVID. Like we see the lengths they're willing to go to maintain or acquire more power. So that's something that does actually worry me, that between election day and the power change, like if something happens that they would be leveraging to prevent that change of power from happening. It's possible. I don't know. I'm not hoping for that whatsoever. I think that I think ultimately light always wins out. Not to sound like super cheesy, but I mean, I don't know if we have to go through something collectively in order to get to that point, or if it's going to be a smoother ride. We're going to see, I guess. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to be close. I think Trump is definitely going to win by a landslide, but whether or not that power change happens in a smooth manner isn't kind of another question. So we'll see how it unfolds. But I would urge everybody to go listen to Danny Jones's podcast with Jack Cruz, which came out a few weeks ago. He really lays out the story of like the history of the military industrial complex exquisitely. He then also published a solo cast that's like 2 hours long that unravels other parts of the story that he didn't get to with Danny on that 4 hour podcast. And those two things would probably be the most important things. Like if somebody is new to the story, if they listen to those two things, it will become abundantly clear how we got to where we are now, what the mechanics are behind it, and also give you plenty of threads to like look into. But it's pretty shocking how things hold up when under scrutiny, essentially. Like if you look at the facts that he's spewing and it's like, this can't possibly be true. And then it's true. It's absolutely chilling at some level. But it's also not surprising that we've kind of gotten to this point now where in the age of information, it's really impossible to hide things anymore. Back when like the Kennedy assassination, it was extremely easy to hide any sort of nefarious underpinnings because there was no, the news media was centralized, newspapers, there was no social media, there was no cell phones. So it was very easy to filter the information that was reaching the populace. Now we're at a point where information is coming at the speed of now, essentially. There's like no buffering time for that. And I think the kind of crumbling of that centralized model is a direct result of that interconnection and this kind of globalization to a certain extent. But, what has its pros also has its cons. And so I think it's going to be a very interesting election and an interesting coming few years, to say the least. But I think the shift towards decentralization is inevitable. They're going to be like hanging on tooth and nail, but it is inevitable, I believe.
Personally, I think it wasn't whether it was Trump won. It's more so if you rig this election, will it be so obvious that the masses will pick up? And maybe you can do that in a close race. Maybe Trump wins 52-48%, and you can kind of rig it where Kamala wins. Cool. But if he wins in a landslide and you try to rig it, okay, the people know what's up. I think that's what the deep state is really considering. Which hand do we want to play? Because you want to talk about the deep state, the 1%, oh, so powerful, so dark, evil, yada yada. Bro, we're the 99%. They're outnumbered like crazy, and we have the Second Amendment. The problem is we're divided.
That's
So
why. I mean, of course, that's not by accident.
that's not by accident. That's intelligently done. I applaud them. But stealing an election like that, you don't want to wake the sleeping giant called We the People. Yeah.
Well, actually, Madhava said something very profound in my podcast. He said, let's be honest. We know that, let's say, the deep state has access to like nuclear style weapons, like, or even if we have like assault rifles, that's not going to stand up to those weapons. But what the Second Amendment actually gives us is the feeling that we can defend
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
ourselves, which is actually even more important than actually being able to. Just having a feeling that you can protect yourself and your family and your community and stand up to authority, that spirit is enough to basically, move mountains essentially.
It's crazy. That reminds me of the concept in 1984 where they control language to the point where freedom is not even a word, or the concept of freedom cannot even be articulated. Therefore, you extinguish its existence. Like you can't even conceive of it. And so the guns are symbolic because, like he said, I did watch that podcast. He said, as long as we know and believe that we can fight, we're gonna be really tough to squash. So I feel like I'm living in some cinematic
Truly.
masterpiece.
Truly.
Honestly,
I got my
that
popcorn.
right? That might be the pseudo matrix getting to us because there was a comment I saw saying like the movie industry's influence on the people is so vast that anytime something epic happens, you will reference cinema like, oh, it was cut straight out of a movie. But that's just like a tangent.
Well, I feel like movies, I mean, obviously humans create movies and we have a history of telling stories. Like we're a storytelling species and
Yes.
myths were a major part of our culture up until very recently. And so I think movies are just a reflection of our psyche and like the archetypal
Hmm.
nature of the way our psyche works. So the movies are actually a reflection of our psyches, I think. And so if we're going to reference that, I think it's relevant.
Yeah, yeah. Here, the collective hero's journey that we're all
Yes.
on is the most epic. It's more epic than any piece of media I've ever seen and any creator could ever conceive of. Like to anyone listening to this, turn off Netflix and look at the world. That's way more entertaining and there's way more at stake. Not to put down any severe consequences like sudden deaths. It's not what I mean, but there's a lot at stake here and you can be a protagonist in a sea of protagonists in this arc of humanity, the epic of humanity. And this is where I wanted to leave off. Maybe someone here is watching because Danny Jones just published his episode of you. Maybe they just came across you and they don't really know like what you stand for, uh, why you're doing what you do, and why this light story is so important to you, why this passing the torch from Jack to you to continue spreading and multiplying decentralized medicine is so key. People don't know that you've been burned by centralized medicine as a kid and on your Saturn return like 4 years ago. So, can you explain how this has been birthed in you and how it's led you to this path?
It's actually pretty interesting reflecting on it because, in the same way that Jack was just at the right place at the right time so many times in his life, that gave him the information that allowed him to piece together this like history story, like
Yeah.
the medical history and tyranny and like the history of the deep state, let's say. I feel kind of similarly for myself to a certain extent. I don't think it's necessarily to the extent that he's been at, but like from 2 years old, I had a very traumatizing dental procedure done that gave me a very bad taste in my mouth, I guess literally, in the
Mm,
medical system. And then starting in first grade, I had chronic recurring strep throat that I then was put on antibiotics for months at a time, got pulled out of school and homeschooled during that time. My weight exploded. I also had Lyme 3 times. Was obese throughout my childhood up through sophomore year of high school, where I came in somewhere around 270 pounds. I had a whole host of skin issues, dysmenorrhea, respiratory issues, and nothing was solved by going to the doctor. I'm actually kind of glad we didn't have insurance when I was growing up because the doctor like consistently wanted to take my tonsils out every time I went in for strep. And like they're so quick to remove organs and just do procedures that instead of basically trying to understand like why is this happening? Why is she getting sick? Like there's no question about the environment and the electromagnetic environment and mold in the house and the lifestyle and the diet and all the things. So I automatically had a bad taste in my mouth with the standard medical approach just because it never actually helped me, even though I was sick for such a long period of my life. And then it turns out, as like a kind of cosmic joke, I find out in, I don't remember what year it was exactly, but probably like 6 or 7 years ago. So like a couple years before my mom ended up passing, that she had hepatitis C from a blood bag that she got when she gave birth to me in 1992. So she basically had hep C for 30 years, didn't know about it, but she actually had a really bad, like she had arthritis, which maybe it wasn't arthritis, maybe it was something else, but she got put on this really strong NSAID drug that ended up separating her stomach from her duodenum. And so she had this massive internal bleeding. When they went in to fix it surgically, they saw she had a fatty liver, but they didn't do any testing or anything like that. They assumed that it was non-alcoholic fatty liver or whatever. She ended up changing her diet and like doing more keto and she lost some weight and she was doing better. But then it turned out that she ended up going back because she had another bleed. So she was having like tarry stools and that's how she knew like she was bleeding internally, obviously. And that time when she went back, they said it was hep C. They also told her that she had like a liver tumor or whatever already. And there was like nothing that they could do. And so that was just like a real slap in the face and it's also a really good example of how fragile people can be when they're chronically ill, because the thing that ended up actually killing her was she got a cough that caused a vein in her stomach to rupture, which then caused her to lose so much blood that she had kidney failure. Of course, the kidneys take up a lot of slack for the liver. They have a lot of overlapping functions. So her liver was kind of trash at that point. So the kidneys took on a lot. So she got kidney failure and then she ended up dying within the span of like a week. So that's basically the story of how I just am dead set to change this broken ass system. And it's not really voluntary at this point. I feel like I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do.
It's it's so unfortunate because this is what really fires me up about this. What Jack lays out, there's a lot of greed at the very top, lots of human nature and greed. And those people don't know how that shit translates down, how it weaves into it. And it's kind of crazy when you capture science and medicine and media, certain stories just seep through the cracks and they're just not told. And the faults, the cracks aren't exposed. I don't know. You can't expose the system, and if you keep a blanket of darkness over it. And
Totally. And I
so,
mean, the thing I think a lot about is that, like, okay, so there was Hep C in that blood bag that she just happened to get,
yeah,
karmically or whatever. Like, why that bag?
yeah,
But also, what else are we missing? Like, there's so much that we're missing. Like, there's probably, whether it's a virus or something else in blood bags that are been given out, whether it's COVID vaccine contaminated immune cells or whatever, and blood bags that are being given to people now that we don't even know the downstream effects of that. It's like there's such a huge blind spot in the centralized approach, and we're just like not even willing to kind of look at it because they basically need to maintain this appearance of being safe and effective, let's say, in their approaches, and to the point where they will literally gaslight people who are experiencing negative effects from their interventions, their procedures, their drugs, whatever. Um, because there's just this lack of accountability that's there's like no accountability present within the system, really. Especially when you look at like the Vaccine Immunity Act in the late 80s, where now the companies can't even get sued. So like what incentive do they have to actually do a good job creating high quality vaccines that are safe, like truly safe? Never mind the like efficacy part of the story. So I think that COVID was an absolute blessing in that it opened a ton of people's eyes to just what they're willing to do to control people. Like the fact that so many people lost their jobs or were threatened to lose their jobs if they didn't take this experimental jab is just absolutely unconscionable. And yet so many people have just moved on and like they're pretending it never happened. So it's pretty wild. I think we need to just keep talking about it. Otherwise it's just gonna happen again. And I think ultimately a lot of people, though, did wake up to the major issues systemically that we have and are beginning to understand, like, this isn't sustainable. We need to find another way of doing things because we spend more money on healthcare than any other developed country and we have the worst outcomes. Why? Like, we're spending money, but where is it actually going? What are they doing? Well, it's because we're not focused on the right things. We're not actually focused on creating health. We're focused on basically infusing money into this complex that just creates more money by keeping people sick. Incentives dictate outcomes, like Jack would say.
mhm.
And so we need to dismember those incentive structures in order to actually make change. Otherwise, they're just going to be optimizing for the bottom line and the quarterly, or the fiscal turnover of or profits or whatever. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I'm really hopeful that Bobby actually understands the problems that are at hand and then he can do some really good work when he gets into some of those 3-letter agencies and begins to drain the swamp, so to speak.
Is a part of what drives you just this like fury and rage that this tragedy happened, or has that been mostly transmuted by now?
Yeah, I don't carry any anger really. I just more think of it like you guys are all fucking dumbasses. That's kind of how I see it. Like I feel like everybody's mostly ignorant and they're just blind, and that's also been engineered into our lifestyles to make people more that way. So I'm mostly driven by curiosity and passion, I would say, and just genuinely interested in knowing more truth and like getting down to the bottom of what really matters. And I happen to have been placed on a narrative path that kind of has teed me up to get to where I am today. But I wouldn't say that I'm driven by anger whatsoever. More so just as a deep passion for creating a future for other people that's not going to look like what I had to go through because it doesn't have
Mm.
to. It's really just about retooling and re-engineering that system so that it's actually working for us instead of against us. And so that's what I would say my perspective is on that. I'm really just a genuinely curious person that wants to know more. And I grew out of the system that brought me up. And now I just want to kind of break it down and build a new one because it's not working.
It's remarkable that your arc immediately puts you in a place where you distrusted medicine. You felt
Yeah.
the collateral effects heavily by what happened to your mom, and life happened to place you, just as passionate as you are, in the hands of a paradigm that happens to be the Achilles heel to centralized science.
Yeah.
And now it also put you in contact with people who can help you really spread the message at lightning fast speeds. I see you on your story all the time, people messaging you, holy moly, this and that, this improved, that improved. I feel better than ever. And the ripples that you're putting out into the world obviously are coming back to you and they're only increasing. And so I just love watching it. I'm a fan for sure. I have my popcorn. um, I think I just love the arc that your life is taking. It has the way it started to now, and it's epic. I can't wait to see because you don't even know how it's gonna unfold. So
I don't. I'm like I'm telling you, oh, there's a bee. I am I'm also a passenger here. I'm like, I don't know where this is going, and everything I'm doing feels involuntary, so I'm just letting it flow through me and we'll see where it goes. But I also like I have hope motivation in human design and anyway, I just always felt that way. Like I'm a very optimistic person. I see the best in scenarios and the potential there. And so I'm very, very hopeful for the future. I think it's going to be just legendary. It's going to be incredible. We just have to get through this bit of a rough patch. It's got a little bit of turbulence to get to paradise, but we're on our way.
yeah, we are. That's awesome. Do you have any final words wrapping up this podcast?
No, I mean, I think we covered, everything I wanted to say. I mean, I would just direct people to my Instagram and I'm the same Dr. Alexis Jasmine on X as well. I've been dealing with some censorship and like shadow banning issues on Instagram. So I've been trying to cross post over on X too. So you can follow me over there as well. I have my podcast, Undoctrinate Yourself, where I interviewed Dr. Seti. I've interviewed Jack 3 times. I have a whole bunch of great guests on there. Usually posting about weekly, so that people can find me there. And yeah, just stay tuned. I think we've got some exciting things coming down the line. So I'll keep you guys all posted on that as things move along.
You're on the bullet train to your dharma, and we got more subject matter to cover in future episodes. Like,
For
really
sure.
curious about the human design part. But as for now, I think that's a pretty good cap on this light story, why it's important on a personal and collective level, the mechanics of it, the logic, the deduction, the political, real world ramifications. In this epic of humanity, the light story is one of the most relevant and powerful veins that anyone could touch on. Huge translational effect. So that's why I
Totally.
love telling it and having people like you on sharing it. So I appreciate you coming on. And yeah, let's make let's make
Make my
mitochondria.
content great again. Thank you for having me. This was really fun. We'll do it again.
Yes, we will. Thank you so much, Alexis. And I will see you guys back next time on the Guiding Lighthouse podcast. Cheers, everybody.
Bye.